So, we finally made it to the end of our semi-annual-ish, whenever Joe takes a vacation and I forgot to take one too, series on Noah's Ark, after just a very brief 3 years and 2 months to finish this five-part series. So I'm excited we finally made it. Over that time, we've had our first four parts. In the first one, we established Genesis was talking about a literal and global flood. Then in part two, we discussed some extra biblical sources of evidence for a global flood. And then after a short 2-year break, we came back and dove into some of the harder questions on the ark, such as in part three on the ark itself, how it floated and was yet big enough, and how was it able to be made out of wood. And then in part four, we turned to the elephant in the room, the actual elephants and the dinosaurs, and how they all fit in there. And now finally we've reached part five, which, as I titled in the bulletin, deals with the floodwaters themselves. To paraphrase the American... There we go. Oh, I guess I skipped that one. Okay. The American folk song, Where Did They Come From? Where Did They Go? Where Did They Come From? Cotton-Eyed Joe. Where did the floodwaters come from? How were there enough of them? And where did they go after wiping out civilization? So, while we haven't ever seen a global flood again, as God promised there, we have seen some pretty severe floods in recent years in areas such as Kentucky, and then this year, most recently, Jamaica, as you can see in those pictures on the screen behind me. There they recorded up to 30 inches of rain, I believe some of the articles I read said, and Jamaica is a country of about 4,244 square miles, so if you assume then that it all got that high amount of rain, that was somewhere along the lines of there at the bottom of your screen, 2.1 trillion gallons of water in that, or in miles, which are a little bit easier to deal with, 2 cubic miles. So the distance, from 13 mile and Shaner down to 12, and then down to 11, and then you go from Shaner to Hoover, and then you go a mile up in the air. That's how much water hit there. And keep that idea in your head, because later we're going to be seeing some much bigger numbers, and that's going to be, well, pardon the pun, a drop in the bucket. So we're going to go ahead and dive into our problem statement now. How could there have been enough water to cover the world, and not just cover it, but to cover it 15 cubits deep? In looking at this, I'm going to be using and summing from a man named Andrew Siddell from an article he wrote called How Much Water Would Be Needed for Noah's Flood. Not because I think he's really a great scholar and expert, but he had some really convenient math to look at, and if you guys remember from some of my previous sermons, I like ones with math. So get ready for a little bit on that in the next slides. So he poses the question is this: given that Genesis 7:20, thank you for reading that, Tony, and I have had several long sermon readings, so I tried to give you a nice short one tonight to balance out. I didn't want to have to pay that forward later, so hopefully Joel will be nice to me now when he gets back, but thank you for reading that for us. And it's also on the screen behind us, and all of the quotes tonight are going to be from the ESV as well as that one. So he goes on and saying, well, you have Mount Everest, which is the tallest point on Earth today, which is 29,028 feet tall, and then you put about 22 and a half feet of water on top of it. Okay, so we've got a diagram on there now that we'll talk a little bit. So why 22 feet? Well, the cubit is 18 inches. Back then was generally conveniently the distance from your fingertip to your elbow, so that way everybody could conveniently measure things. Terrible for standardization, but we use about 18 inches now when we translate it for what that roughly meant. So that's where we get that 22 to 23 feet. And so they then look at it as a shell. You have the Earth today being at sea level, is the little gray circle in the middle, and then the blue circle around it would be the floodwater stacking on top of it to go up to Everest plus that 22 feet. So to get that volume, the volume of a sphere is 4/3 times the constant pi times the radius of that sphere cubed. So then when you get a shell, you subtract from the bigger one, that you then subtract the little circle. So the yellow line there, that is the radius of the Earth at sea level, which NASA has measured to be 3,960. And so then you would also have the orange line then is sea level plus Everest plus 22 feet, which is adds like I think total about 5.5 miles on the Earth. So then when you put all of that in, you end up with about 1 billion cubic miles of water that you would need in order to cover all of Earth from sea level to be that deep. But, the author does say, hey, you do have Mount Everest. There are other mountains. I'll let you take a quarter of that out. So you only need 800 billion. Can you come up with 800 million cubic miles of water? Well, you go and look at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They say today the oceans hold about 321 million cubic miles, so a little less than half of what he thinks you would need for a flood. So he's like, all right, I'm done. There you go. There's nowhere near that much water. Where would it be? Well, show me where the water is. Okay, we're done. And, well, if that really was all there was, this would be pretty short. We'd be done now. I've only been talking, like 5-6 minutes? That'd be really too short for a sermon, so clearly there's got to be something else. And for that, we're then going to go ahead and challenge some of his assumptions. We're not going to back down from that, as the Bible said, the Earth was covered that deep. Instead, what I would argue with you is Mount Everest isn't that old. So, as we discussed last time, the concept of Pangea, back at the beginning of the world, generally both creationists and skeptics, atheists, believe that at one point all of the continents did fit together into one big continent, which is called Pangea, and then you had one ocean outside of it called Panthalassa. I learned that one this time, where, as described, creationists say that, yeah, that makes sense with Genesis 1 there, and everybody else is like, no, the pieces fit together, even without believing someone put it there, that makes sense to them. But so where we tend to disagree is on the timeline of when Pangea existed. So the guy who came up with this theory, Alfred Wegener, a German back in 1912, he puts it as being around from about 300 to 200 million years ago, around like the Jurassic period, and then they just slowly moved apart at the rate we see them move today by plate tectonics. And so they're like, okay, humans have only been around a few million years. That was hundreds of millions of years ago, so anything we read about written by humans has to be in the world as we see it today. Whereas creationists, we say, no, the Bible starts, we showed up day 6. So there was then man on Pangea. And so in the breaking up of the earth during the flood from the fountains of the deep, you had the pieces up and move and overlap, and then Everest came later after the flood. So that's kind of where I'm disbelieving with them. So then, interesting to look at. So what could the waters we have today do then? Because there are some other creationists who believe that there in 719, the Hebrew in like the KJV, they translated it as hills instead of mountains there. Whereas where Tony read it and we had it on the screen, it was written as mountain. I thought I had the Hebrew word there, but now I'm not seeing it. But anyway, so then, if you had a hill, that's only, hills go up to 2,000 feet. There's not a hard and fast rule, but that's kind of where everybody more or less has agreed a hill versus a mountain. And so that is a whole lot less that you have to cover with water. And as you keep going out, you keep adding more and more as it keeps getting bigger. So you really, to cover all the hills, you would only need about 0.4 miles of water, which would be about 8% as much, which is only 61 million cubic miles of water. So that is doable, but I don't really agree with that hypothesis they put out because, here it is, the Hebrew word hiharim, I'm sure I butchered that, but throughout the Old Testament it's translated as both hills and mountains. In fact, actually there in verse 20 it is translated as mountain, and of the 53 occurrences I found in my Hebrew concordance through Google, only 6 is it actually translated as hills. So I think it's kind of more in Hebrew poetry where they tend to repeat themselves and exaggerate for emphasis, just saying whether it was hills or mountains, all of the land was deeply covered in water. So then, how deep could the water we have today go? Well, working backwards from that, from the about 321, if we assume all of the ocean went out and in all of the eruption of the flood, it was roughly flat underneath, you could get about 2 miles deep. So the distance from 13 mile to 11 mile down there, you take that, and you put it up over the ground, and that's how much water there would have been everywhere at that point. So that's a lot of water you got there, and that would cover even some pretty small mountains in that. So then, where did that water come from? So in the accounts there in Genesis 7:11 and 8:2, they refer to things called the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven opening. But what do these literally refer to from the text? We'll start first then with fountains of the deep. Highlighted them there in the verses on the screen behind me. The whole phrase "fountains of the deep" was really only used also in Proverbs 8:28, where he's kind of also talking about God's creation, and as his process of creation, he limited the seas and marked the foundation. So very similar to Genesis account. But then the slightly smaller phrase, "the great deep," is used 3 other times. First there in Isaiah 51:10, referring down to the deeps as the Lord carried them over in his care for his people, and also metaphorically in Amos 7, as God's wrath would be fiery enough to dry up even the great deeps. And lastly in Psalm 36:6, where it is used as a metaphor for God's justice, pointing to something incredibly large. And then breaking it down even a little bit further, you have the phrase "the deep," is used a little bit more often. First, either oceans or other large expanses of water, such as in Genesis 1:2, where God did create the sea, separate from the land. And he used it in his speech there in Job in 38:30 and 41:32. And then also David used it in a couple of times in the Psalms in 42:7 and 104:6, which we'll talk more about Psalm 104 in a little while. And then also the prophets used it in Isaiah again in 63:13. There it referred to the Red Sea during the Exodus in his recounting of history. In Ezekiel 26:19, don't remember from class, but hopefully somebody else was paying attention that day. It hadn't been too long since we covered it in Sunday morning Bible class. The great waters that God commanded. And then during class last Wednesday, as Roland touched on Jonah's prayer there in 2 and 3, he talked about in his prayer that he and the fish were in the deeps. So, thus, the most likely interpretation of fountains of the deep is some source in or at the bottom of the ocean capable of ejecting large quantities of water. Very possibly like the undersea fissures between the plates that we see today, such as a large shift between them disrupting the bed and potentially raising up the floor would have lifted up or jetted up a whole lot of water, flooding the areas around the coast first. For more information on that subtopic, I would really recommend the article by S.A. Austin called "Catastrophic Plate Tectonics, a Global Flood Model of Earth History." He wrote that back in 1994. And that explains for us tonight the fountains of the deep, and then the next source that was listed there is the windows of heaven. This one is a little bit more straightforward, as in the verses it was talking about it. Did we get another pop-up? It's not wanting to... Okay. There we go. This is pointing into rain. However, as this one then went on for 40 days and nights, this was not just a summer shower, and in those 40 days, this wasn't a light misting. This was a heavy, miraculous amount of rain, as used in the other times where we see... Oh, there we go. windows of heaven is also used in 2 Kings 7, describing God ending the siege of Samaria by Ben Hadad, and also metaphorically in Malachi 3, in verse 10, describing how God poured his blessings out on his people. So then this rainfall is heavier and directed from God in a miraculous amount of rain, which, though not really being convincing to our skeptic because it involves a God influencing things, hey, we believe there's a God. It's self-consistent with our arguments. And so then at that point, we've answered, I think, pretty well those first two questions of how much water would you have needed for a flood and where did it come from, leaving us with our last question of where did they go? One answer some people love to jump to being glaciers. You have a giant amount of water pulled up and frozen in blocks, and that there would have been a pretty large amount of climactic shift after that much water being released and covering all of the land and then trying to get it back into the water cycle. And you certainly could have had some of that creating glaciers or maybe some larger ones, but today less than 3% or so of all of the water that we know where it is not in the oceans. So that's not only glaciers, but that also includes all of the lakes, the groundwater, the aquifers, all of those kinds of sources. So the glaciers could have taken some up, but that really wouldn't have been enough for all of them. Because even if you're like, oh, there would have been more because it was colder, well, then they would have remelted and we would have lost more land to those melting glaciers, and we really haven't seen a whole lot of that in what we have recorded in history. And then another theory that's gaining more traction in recent years is an underground storage, that down in the crust. Previously, we thought water could only be stored up to about 186 miles below ground. However, there's some more recent studies now where there are minerals such as brucite and ringwoodite, a high-pressure phase of magnesium silicate, which can hold water atoms all the way down to 400 miles or more below the surface. So there's very possibly a large amount stored down below the crust, back in those reservoirs below the deeps, that we can't measure how much is in there at the moment. And then finally, there's also following the precept that Scripture is its own best interpreter, looking at a couple of other passages that discuss the flood, kind of sort of seem to point, I think, towards oceans that we have today, and I think that makes a lot of sense, but we'll look at those now together shortly. The first of those was, again, in God's speech to Job in chapter 38, specifically the part between verses 8 and 11. Here the Lord asked Job about the shutting in of the seas after they had burst from the womb, and how he set limits for them, preventing them from going all across the land. While the prologue of Job is believed by some to have been added a whole lot later, the story of Job is generally accepted to fit between the times of Noah and Abraham in the patriarchal age. And so then this bursting from the womb of the seas would fit in well with the bursting open of the fountains of the deep to start the flood. And so then with that, passage would imply that the waters of the flood were then contained by God afterwards into the seas and oceans. And then, as promised, the other passage we'll look at a little bit longer is Psalms 104, as David is describing the greatness and majesty of God. Specifically of interest to us tonight is the section from verses 6 to 9. In verse 7 there, God rebukes the waters, causing them to flee. And in verse 8, it describes as the mountains rise and the valleys sink to the places that God has set for them. After which, in verse 9, David agrees with the author of Job that the Lord then set a boundary that they may not pass again. So then, to answer our skeptic in more colloquial terms, that after the catastrophic geological worldwide flood, the tectonic plates that comprised the ocean floor then sank back down, and the continent plates rose up between them, and then in their slamming together, folded up and created the mountains we see today. And so then, water runs downhill. It went from the higher down into the lower and filled the large ocean basins, and that's where the water went. And so then, in closing tonight and of our series, I really hope it's been helpful, that you guys will have more answers to be able to give people who have questions for you on the Ark, that these are all online and available to refer back to. And then here are some of the resources we did use today if you want to look into them in more depth. And also at the end, there's a bit of a free bonus. There's a longer one on how you have all the modern people groups we have today come out of just the 8 people that came off of the ark, or really 6, because there's not a whole lot of account of Noah and his wife having more kids after being 600. But it's while it's related to the story of Noah's Ark, it's a little bit outside of our scope, and I don't know that anyone really wanted a part 6 on that. So, but it is there if you want to study it on your own. And so then, as we wrap up tonight, I would be remiss if didn't offer an invitation. While most of our time tonight has been in studying the flood waters of Noah's Ark, there are some waters that are a little bit more important to us today, namely those back there, the waters of baptism. As Peter said in his comments on Noah's Ark there in chapter 3, similarly now baptism saves us through the resurrection of Christ. So now we invite you, if you haven't been saved, to come forward so we can help you tonight, or if you have been saved but you need the help and prayers of your brothers and sisters, to please come forward as we stand and sing.